Thank you to all the panel members. That was very stimulating. And we want to open this up now to a discussion, and the format that was proposed by the organizers was to have a bit of a discussion between us, comment, questions between the panelists, and then to open it up to a broader discussion with the public. So I'll maybe start off with a few comments, questions for the panel, and they can proceed with their own comments and questions or react to something that I've said and others have said. One issue is to see how criminalization functions. Lazy, you talked about that, Gary as well, and how that is aligned with the racialization itself. And whether within the communities that are so racialized or criminalized, are there also fissures of defending oneself as being the good immigrant or as being somehow more worthy and trying to fit into whatever that national discourse is. And the second comment kind of flows from that, because I've been reading, or actually listening to on my drive to work, rereading Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities and thinking about nationalism as imagined communities and how the discourses that create that work. And Tanda, you talked about kind of this juxtaposition of sovereignty on the one hand and these registers of discourses that are racializing the other. But are they not kind of conjoined in official nationalism? And an official nationalism is always a nationalism that defends and protects the interests of an elite by using the mechanisms of state to do that. And that seems to be what we're seeing here in terms of European Christian nationalism. And is that to be juxtaposed against some other popular nationalism? Is, for example, Gary, what you talk about, Latinos identifying themselves as American through the process of participating in some of these mobilizations, is that kind of giving rise to the construction of a popular nationalism, or the mobilizations we're seeing now post-Trump, is that giving rise to a popular nationalism? Or is it more of a tectonic struggle between a Trump official nationalism and something like an Obama official nationalism that tries to construct the nation along another imagined community? And is nationalism even a strategic choice that those who want to resist this should or need to make, or do we go some other route besides the constructing an image of the nation? So I'll leave it at that, and you can react to that or have your own comments reacting to some of the other presentations. Anybody want to start?
Joe, I thought you were my friend, and here you are. So it's hard not to respond with many questions, because I think everything that you're saying is very provocative. But to your question about whether the registers that I was identifying that legitimate racial exclusion can really be separated from the concept of state sovereignty, I think they are intimately related. And even within international law, the way that state sovereignty comes to be what it is in modern international law is right after the period of colonialism, where you now have formal state sovereignty that has built into it racialized structure. So I don't want to overstate the distance between those two things. I think under the current framework of state sovereignty, the racialization it comes in through that direction. And as a result, and for other reasons, I struggle to think about nationalism that doesn't ultimately default to some kind of ethno-racialization. And it may be that it's conceivable in a different framework other than the one that we have, but the distance between those two things is just, and you see it in other parts of the world. So South Africa, where you have a very strong discourse now that I would describe as nationalist, that seeks to consolidate or at least undo some of a lot of the hierarchy that of apartheid that remains intact. So racial inequality along black and white lines, where you have a white minority that still in many ways holds on to the economic sovereignty of the country. Even that nationalist movement nonetheless is resulting in the exclusion of Africans, even Africans who are nationalized in that context. So that's one example that makes it hard for me to imagine that any discourse that starts out as nationalist, even if in those moments of the initial moments of its articulation stay away from the language of race, it's my own view is that you end up getting there. And that's a very deep critique of the nation state, and it's where I am now. It's conceivable that form of political community can be resuscitated in some way that doesn't lead it in that direction. But all things being the way they are, I see them as so deeply intertwined.
I'll take a stab at your comment or question about how this criminalization plays out and is also racialized in that process. And just say that in other work with sociologist Cecilia Menjivar, we write about what we term legal violence against immigrants. And what we refer to there is the fact that, in this society, we claim to really kind of revere the law, right? And so when you have things like even, criminal aliens, and we use this language that dehumanizes migrants in all of these ways, it makes it acceptable, it makes it normal to know that they're being harmed, that they're being detained, that children are being forced to represent themselves in court, right? We're more likely to look the other way because they broke the law, right? They're criminals somehow. And so the fact that we have legal language that lays out the framework in a more popular way makes it less likely that people will really question, why is this happening? And it has lots of other repercussions even for migrants and how they understand themselves and whether they really truly are criminals and deserve to have their human rights, right? So it has repercussions. I see it with students who are undocumented, who also, question whether to be acceptable as an immigrant, they have to be perfect, the good immigrant, bad immigrant kind of discourse. We heard Obama use it over and over. We're deporting felons, not families. That kind of discourse really pushed that divide. Trump is kind of pushing that, no longer using that binary so much, and it's not clear where he's going to go with the people who were considered the good immigrants, but it has the effects on the end of who's targeting migrants. It has the effects on migrants internalizing those ideas and feeling like they have to live up to this expectation of being superhuman to be acceptable in this country.
I'm going to respond on both questions, and I'll start with Lazy's response on the question of criminalization, because I agree with her entirely, and I would go a step further and say that the construction of the alien as criminal, the construction of the immigrant as somehow or another inherently in violation, it might have purposes to divide us, it might have purposes to create internalized norms of subjugation, but it also, I think, in its principal purpose is to make white people feel good. I've been polling on this question for a very long time, and only about 18 to 19% of the American public favors some form of mass deportation. Now, that's a lot of people, but it's only 18 or 19%. The vast majority of Americans don't harbor deep hostility to all immigrants all the time. But if you construct that immigrant population as criminal, then the deportations, there's no cognitive dissonance introduced by watching the government do what it's doing now, what it's been doing, and what it's about to do, right? And in the last time I was invited into the Obama White House, and I put the emphasis on last time, I had this conversation with the director of domestic policy at the time, Cecilia Munoz, and I pointed out to her that their Secure Communities program, which was supposed to be deporting the worst of the worst, that in fiscal 11, so this was in 2012, which was the last year we had full data on at that point, the #1 criminal offense for which the worst of the worst were deported was driving without a license. Now tell me how that stop occurred. The only way that can be the only violation is if the police were just racially profiling, randomly stopping brown people. So I think it's designed to make white people feel, well, they're only getting rid of bad people, and that's okay. You know, on this question of what constitutes nationalism, I think there's a big debate on this in political science. Roger Smith, the political theorist, has written extensively about this. He sort of thinks of we can conceive the American history as liberalism, as civic republicanism, or his very clever term, ascriptive inegalitarianism, which is the history that says that in order for there to be an us, there must always be a them. And unfortunately, we can identify the groups who've been the them. I'm concerned, however, if we take as a given the notion that we cannot have a multiracial, multicultural nationalism in a democratic society, even though I accept the premise that nationalism is fraught with all sorts of implicit dangers. And that is that if that is in fact so, then we are essentially saying that the racial project, in order to move forward, requires the deconstruction of the nation state, which is a very robust thing, and has resisted deconstruction for a great deal of time. And so I'm going to take a Coca-Cola perspective and say that maybe there's a way to have a multiracial, multicultural, and Coca-Cola is the source of all optimism. And I'm reminded of a Coca-Cola commercial before about 20 years ago now, I'm old, maybe 25 years ago, and it was a salute to the athletes of the Olympics, and it's a scroll across faces. It says, Coca-Cola salutes the Spaniards, and the Nigerians, and the Germans, and the Japanese, and the Australians, and the Indians, and the Argentines, and then it zooms back, and they're all standing at the base of the Statue of Liberty, and they say, all of whom will be competing for the United States at the 1992 Olympic Games. I got very touched. Because those are the elements of American history that you want to embrace. So I'm fearful that if we link deconstructing nation states to any form of multicultural racial justice, that we might be trapping ourselves in a very difficult situation.
Can I just say one quick thing, which is that I want to be clear that I think there's a world we could imagine where the nation state exists but has a different type of relevance. And I think we've already seen it now, right? So you can decouple the concept of sovereignty from the nation state very easily. And you could conceive of other ways of organizing that don't give the nation state the kind of role that it has right now. And I think, yes, nation state still is the predominant form, but there are other ways, even internationally and transnationally, that people are affiliating that I think undercut the evils of the nation state being the most dominant form around which we identify and organize political life, economic life, social life. So yes, I think I lean closer to the camp that would say, let's just get rid of it if we can. But even if, for those people who don't think we should be getting rid of it fast, there are ways in which we can change the role that it plays in structuring who we are and who we consider the other. And I think if we are serious about racial equality, it's not possible, I think, to make progress without confronting how deeply racialized the concept of the nation state is in the way that it structures our interactions with each other.
I think that's fair.
And can I
Yeah.
just quickly, along those lines, I feel really heartened by all of the social movements that are taking place right now, and young people really trying to figure out what does this mean in practice, that Black Lives Matter, the really strong immigrant rights movement is being led by youth who are thinking about, I have human rights, even if I don't have citizenship in this country. And so, really questioning what that means and building alliances across different groups and recognizing the full humanity of each group is super important.
Thanks. I'll have to turn to the organizers. I know we've hit 10:30, and I really apologize for not giving enough time to open up to the audience. Do we have some time to at least have a few questions, or how? Okay, thank you. So let's open it up to see if there are other comments or questions.
Hi, my name's Mari Matsuoka, and I'm in a movement, one that's helped to stop fascism in this country right now, and also a larger movement to actually change the entire system. But I have a question, because I really, really appreciate, how people have linked this, because, I mean, the thing around the nation state of the United States is inherently racist. I mean, it goes back, if you're talking about the relationship to other countries and the national chauvinism to countries like El Salvador, all over the world, and then, of course, slavery. But I think what I wanted to talk about was all of it, it's very linked with it's very continuous with the fabric of this country, what's going on now, right now. It's expressions that were, there all the time, and yet they've come out in these now horrific forms. And I wanted you to talk about the new form right now. I mean, we talk about fascism, because this is not just this or that attack or this increase of some intolerance, but a whole package. And the violence right now, and you spoke to this, the violence. This woman with a brain tumor who was dragged out of a hospital in Texas, a Salvadoran immigrant, and dragged out and not allowed to go back to a hospital where she was just diagnosed with brain cancer. This is the kind of violence and ugly hatred that's being fomented in this country. That's a whole different thing, a whole different package, and I wanted you to speak to that.
Should we take a group of questions just so that
Okay.
then it will be more efficient and answer?
Okay, we have somebody who was actually waiting over here for a question.
Good morning. My name is Tolu Bigben, and I'm an attorney, and I'm also a PhD student here in the Nebraska School of Education. Thank you for your presentations this morning, and I wanted to ask, wanted to get your thoughts on how the Trump campaign and the subsequent presidency has not only reinforced the ethno-racialization of immigrants, but simultaneously reinforced or redefined whiteness.
Hi, my name is Janiane. I'm a PhD student in education as well. And I think a lot of these conversations, my question to the panel would be, for those of us who identify this way, should there be some fear that incidentally no one's really talking brazenly about Islamophobia as a force driving a lot of these policies, and especially around citizenship, so framing it as though Muslims are exclusively immigrants, although the vast majority in the US are actually citizens.
One more, and then we'll have the panel respond.
Hi, my name's Corey Russell. I'm an attorney with the Western Center on Law and Poverty, and I work almost exclusively with public benefits, CalFresh, Medicaid. And what we're seeing now is threats to how immigrants access public benefits, and we're talking about lawfully present immigrants as well as undocumented immigrants, so people, green card holders. And I'm wondering, from a very practical standpoint, how we can use actual data and facts to say that immigrants put a lot more into the economy than they get out of it. Using, to Lacey's point about language and what that means. There's this concept of public charge, like you can't come into the United States if you're going to be a drain on our society. How do we present, or can you conceive of a way to present actual information to rebut or even hopefully to defeat these nationalistic notions that immigrants are a threat and a drain to American society and economy?
All right.
I'm going to ask Gary to start, 'cause I'm still thinking, so I'm pushing it over to that side. Go on first.
So I'm going to start with the last question because it really struck a chord with me. The evidence that immigration is a net positive for the United States is really irrefutable at this point, and has largely been driven, as I mentioned during my talk, by the employment behavior of employers in the United States, and the fairly rapidly growing economy, first in the mid-'90s and then in the wake of the Great Recession. That said, I think sort of illustrating that immigrants don't really cost the society a lot of money or whatever, really misperceives what I think is the root nature of racism. That whites are perfectly willing to pay money to maintain the racial status quo. If we go back to the civil rights era in the 1950s and 1960s during the Montgomery bus boycott or the boycott of merchants in Greensboro, North Carolina and elsewhere, the whole libertarian argument that racism is bad for business and that eventually the market will solve it has revealed itself repeatedly to be complete nonsense. People will happily forfeit income in dollars to maintain racial hierarchies to which they attach greater value. And so that immigrants don't cost anything is really kind of beside the point. Because not wanting immigrants is racially rooted. And I think the most recent example of that was in the wake of SB 1070, Alabama, Georgia, and a number of southern states passed copycat laws. And in some instances, you had agricultural produce rotting in the fields in Alabama and Georgia because they did not have sufficient labor to bring in the crop. At the same time, the governors and legislatures elected by those primarily white populations were passing the laws to keep out that workforce. Like, people are perfectly willing to pay dollars to maintain racial hierarchies.
There's a lot on the table, and so I'm gonna see where I can interject a little bit. In terms of what is the new violence, we're still sort of figuring that out. Migration scholars are really reading closely through the executive orders and then paying attention to statistics about who's being detained and deported. And what we're really seeing is that the numbers haven't changed that much yet. It's really the same practices that were going on under Obama, but it's a different moment in which we're all paying more attention. And so we're noticing that this has been going on. And it's a moment where you have our new president speaking in ways that really make it acceptable for more people to express hate openly. And so that increases the fear, right? There are also a handful of folks who are DACA recipients who were previously untouchable who have now been detained. And I'm not sure if any of them have actually been deported yet, but that wasn't happening. That is one new thing that we're seeing. So in terms of what this new violence is, we haven't yet seen the full change, I would say. In terms of this idea of redefining whiteness, the main thing that I've been seeing is that Jews have been kind of, they're being pulled out of that category when we've studied for a long time about how Jews became white, right? There's a book about this, and that is being questioned because Christianity seems to really be at the focus of who supported Trump, a very conservative kind of Christianity, and so yes, that category is also at play in terms of really fighting back against the discourse that immigrants are only here to take advantage of this wonderful country that offers so many benefits to everyone. It's a false, statement that gets said over and over, and I agree with what Gary said about it isn't the point, but even beyond that, from my perspective, it's dangerous to focus all our energy on proving migrants' worth in these ways that can be, seen numerically, because in the end, we're human beings, right? We're protecting human beings, and so it's falling into that discourse of dehumanization to say that for migrants to be acceptable in any form, they have to be these perfect human beings when no one is that, right? And so I push that point a lot because I see what it does to my students and their families who can't maintain perfection and then feel like if they're not absolutely perfect, they don't deserve any rights, which is a problem, right? But I do, on the other hand, understand that people want to point out that immigrants are hard workers, that they have, lower rates of crime and all of this. And I do see the reports. They're out. There's lots of journalists covering these statistics as well.
So I'll address the question on Islamophobia. I think of Islamophobia as being a particular expression of xenophobia. If you think of foreigners as an intersectional category that is constituted on the basis of your nationality, national origin, race, religion is clearly salient. And the way I have been looking at Islamophobia or thinking about being Muslim and how salient a category that is right now and marking people as foreign is just how mobile a register of anxiety it is right now. So you see European leaders, American leaders, you see Kenyan leaders usually using the same exact language to legitimate exclusion of populations that may include Muslims, but are actually very different. But it's the template is the same, and it's being used in so many different places. And over a period of time, the last 2 years, or even the last year and a half, to see the same language be moved and used so effectively in so many different places, I think is truly frightening.
I think we're about out of time. My last thought is on the question of violence. I view terrorism as wielding absolute power with absolute discretion, and after reading the executive orders, I think this administration is a terrorist administration. But with that,
The privilege of the last word.
sorry we went a little over time. We have a break now.